You smelled it before you saw it. Coffee, ground fresh at the front of the store, dark and warm, and everywhere at once. Under that, the sawdust the butcher threw down behind his counter, and the clean paper he tore off a big roll to wrap your mother's chops. A rack of stamps sat by the register, the ones you licked and stuck in a little book at the kitchen table. You did not think of it as a memory then. It was just Tuesday. In 1916, a man named Clarence Saunders opened a store in Memphis, Tennessee, and did something nobody had done before. He took the clerk out from behind the counter, put the groceries on open shelves, gave you a basket, and let you walk the aisles and pick your own. He called it Piggly Wiggly, and patented the idea of the self-serving store. That one store changed how every American family bought its food. Piggly Wiggly is still out there, but almost everything it spawned is gone. The big regional chains that grew up in its shadow, the ones your mother pushed a cart through every single week, are mostly dead now, and the rest are shadows of what you remember. These are 15 of them. If you grew up in a certain place, one of these was simply the store. Count them down and see how many you walked through yourself. If you grew up in Nebraska, it was Hinky Dinky. The name came from an old soldier's song, and Midwestern children in the 50s thought it was about the funniest thing you could paint on a building. 3 brothers named Newman and their cousin Ben Silver opened the first one in Omaha in 1925 at 24th and Vinton. It was tiny by national standards, only about 40 stores at its mid-1960s peak, most of them in Nebraska. But in Omaha, it was enormous. By the mid-30s, Hinky Dinky was taking at least 30 cents of every dollar the city spent on groceries, which meant nearly every family shopped under that sign. A Dallas company bought it in 1972, and in 1985, that company closed its last 25 stores just weeks before the chain would have turned 60. There was no ceremony. One of the best-loved names in Omaha simply came down. If you grew up in Philadelphia, you could spot a Penn Fruit from a block away. The roof gave it away, a great arched barrel vault of a thing, and a wall of glass at the front that made the store look modern and prosperous in a way nothing else on the street did. It started in 1927 as a little produce stand at 52nd and Market, 3 men named Kaplan and Cook selling fruit. By the early 70s, it had grown to around 80 stores and $370 million in sales. Penn Fruit was copied by everyone, and then the same people who copied it killed it. In 1973, Acme came at Penn Fruit with a price war, 173 stores against a handful, right in its own backyard. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1975 and was finished by 1979. The buildings would not die, though. Around 40 of them are still standing today, their arched roofs still giving them away. If you grew up in Columbus, Ohio, your first supermarket had a real live bear at the door. Big Bear opened in 1934 in a converted dance hall on West Lane Avenue, and it is credited as the first self-serve supermarket in the whole Midwest. The founder, Wayne Brown, kept an actual trained bear at the entrance for the first few years. At grand openings, the cameras flashed, while that bear appeared to ring up sales at the register, a genuine civic event. The bear eventually outgrew its cage and went to the Columbus Zoo around 1942, but the store kept growing, up to 70 supermarkets across Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. What killed it had nothing to do with groceries. A company called Penn borrowed heavily to buy Big Bear in 1989, then hung that loan around the chain's neck. Every year spent paying off the buyout was a year the stores could not be fixed up, and by 2004 the last was closed. If you grew up along the Mississippi where Iowa meets Illinois, you shopped at Eagle, the oldest name on this whole list. It began back in 1893, a family grocery in Davenport, Iowa, and for 110 years it fed the Quad Cities and the little towns around them. By 1981, it had 136 stores and $1.2 billion in sales. But Eagle got passed from owner to owner like a hand-me-down coat. A Chicago company bought it. Then Lucky Stores out in California bought it and slapped a new name on the buildings, and later a New York investment firm took it over. Nobody kept owning Eagle long enough to care about it. Up against Jewel Osco and Hy-Vee and the giants moving in, the stores fell behind, and after a bankruptcy, the last of them were auctioned off in 2003. 110 years gone at a sale. If you grew up in Chicago, National Tea was as common on the corner as a church or a firehouse. Two brothers named Rasmussen started it in 1899, and it grew fast. More than 1,600 stores by 1929, red and white signs all over the middle of the country. By the 50s, the stores were clean and bright and air-conditioned, a house brand called Natco beside the national labels. Here's the strange, quiet way National Tea died. A Canadian company bought it in 1956, back when it was doing more than $600 million a year and employed 20,000 people, and shoppers never noticed a thing. The name stayed on the buildings. But starting in the mid-'70s, that owners sold off the American stores one region at a time, Chicago, then Indianapolis, then Minneapolis, then the last pieces in St. Louis and New Orleans by 1995. Shoppers in each city just woke up one morning to a new banner on the same old store, a name that once ran 1,600 storefronts gone without ever saying goodbye. If you grew up in Milwaukee, Kohl's meant groceries, not sweaters, and yes, it was the same family. Maxwell Kohl opened a corner grocery in the Bayview neighborhood in 1927, years before anyone in the family sold clothing. In 1946, he opened a proper supermarket with an in-store bakery, and the smell of fresh bread pulled Milwaukee in. By 1972, it was the biggest grocer in Milwaukee, 56 stores across the southeast corner of Wisconsin. Saturday morning meant a stop at Kohl's for brats to grill and rolls warm from the bakery. Then, in 1983, A&P bought the whole thing. 60-some stores handed over to distant management in New York. Longtime shoppers felt uneasy the day the beloved local name slipped under a company 1,000 miles away, and their unease was earned. Within 20 years, A&P had shuttered every single one. If you grew up in Southern California, your mother sent you into Alpha Beta, and there was a good chance you could get a hot meal while you were there. The name came from a genuinely odd idea. When it started in 1915 in Pomona, the founders arranged every product on the shelves in alphabetical order, A to Z. By the time you shopped there, the alphabet was long gone, but the name had stuck, and most Californians never knew it once meant anything at all. Alpha Beta grew past 300 stores. Many of the big ones had an Alfie's restaurant tucked off to the side, a sit-down counter right inside the supermarket where you could get a bite before or after you shopped, decades before Walmart and Target ever tried the same trick. A national grocery company had owned Alpha Beta since the early 60s, and by September of 1995, the name was gone, the stores turned into Ralph's and Lucky and Food 4 Less. If you grew up in Minnesota, you knew the owl. That big-eyed red owl on the sign is the thing people remember first, before they remember anything about the store itself. Red Owl started in Rochester, Minnesota in 1922 and grew into the store that fed the upper Midwest, 172 stores across 10 states by the 60s. In small towns, it was often the only full-service grocery for 20 miles. The meat counter cutting fresh behind the glass. A candy rack at the checkout where a kid picked one thing. At its peak, Red Owl held more than half the grocery business in the entire state, 55 cents of every grocery dollar in Minnesota. Then a holding company bought it in 1968 and pushed it towards selling non-food merchandise. And by most accounts, that was the beginning of the end. The money stopped flowing into the stores, they started to look second-rate, and in 1988 the chain was swallowed by a bigger company, and the name quietly disappeared. Here is how much that store meant. 30 years after it closed, 75 former Red Owl workers were still meeting once a year for lunch. If you grew up in the Northeast, Grand Union was the supermarket in New York and New Jersey and up through New England. It went all the way back to 1872, when it began as a little tea company in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and grew into one of the great grocery chains in the country, past $1 billion in sales by 1968. Under its own trading stamp program, you collected little orange and green stamps and cashed the filled booklets in for housewares. And then a British financier bought control of it in 1973, the first big foreign movie on an American grocery chain. And the shoppers noticed nothing at all but the debt that came with that deal sat on the company for the next 20 years like a stone. There was a long strike, a loss of more than $100 million in a single year, and finally 3 separate bankruptcies before the century turned. By 2001, the chain your family had trusted was broken up and sold off, and the name came down over the whole Northeast. If you grew up in Philadelphia or down the mid-Atlantic coast, Food Fair was where your mother pushed the cart. 2 brothers named Friedland built it out of a single price-cutting store in Pennsylvania, and it grew into more than 500 supermarkets across 14 states, doing well over $2 billion a year. In its home city of Philadelphia, only one chain sold more groceries. In the 70s, the Cheapney swapped the name over its stores to Pantry Pride. Every last one by 1977, same stores and same faces at the register. A strange new name on the front. Then the whole thing came apart. The company had been filing false reports, telling the world it was healthy while it was quietly bleeding, and in 1978 it filed for bankruptcy. Shoppers were blindsided. By early 1979, the chain had walked out of its own home city, closing or selling more than 50 Philadelphia stores, even though it was the second biggest grocer in town. To the families who had shopped there for 40 years, it felt like being left. If you grew up in New England, the name over the door read First National, and it felt as solid and permanent as a bank. It was born in 1925 out of a merger of 3 old Boston-area grocery companies, and for a while it was one of the largest chains in America, more than 2,700 stores, in the middle of the Depression. Across Greater Boston, the Fine-Ast House brand was a household name. For one, Berkshire Writer First National was the store that brought the very first real supermarket his town had ever seen, which is exactly why what came next hit so hard. In 1980, the company closed 52 New England supermarkets in a single announcement carried on the newswire. For a lot of families, it was the first time it dawned on them that a store they had leaned on their whole lives could just disappear. A Dutch company bought what was left, and in May of 1999, the last First National stores, out in Ohio by then, had their signs changed to another name. If you grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, Lucky was your store. It was Safeway's rival, friendlier, and a little scrappier, and everyone knew it gave you better value for the dollar. It started in 1931 and opened its flagship in San Leandro in 1947 and grew into one of the biggest food chains in the country. Lucky even ran a chain of giant stores called Gemco, where a California family could buy groceries, clothes, and a prescription under one roof, a big box store years before the big box had a name. Lucky shows you the cruelest way a store can vanish, which is that the building stays and the name goes. When Gemco shut down in the mid-'80s, shoppers who had gone there every week for 20 years walked into the same building a month later and found a Target. Then, in 1998, Albertsons bought Lucky's parent company and retired the Lucky name across the West. But people would not let the name go. 8 years later, a company revived it, put the Lucky sign back over dozens of Bay Area stores, and the shoppers came right back, a loyalty that outlasted the erasure. Number 3 is not a store at all. It came to your door. Before Jewel had a single supermarket, it had the Jewel Tea-Man, and he knocked at the back kitchen door, never the front. It started in Chicago in 1899 when a grocer's son named Frank Skiff set out with $700, 1 horse, and 1 wagon. The Jewel Man was more like the milkman than a salesman. He wore a uniform, knew every family on his route by name, remembered the birthdays, and was trusted at the back door. And for big enough orders over time, he handed out pieces of a dish pattern called Autumn Leaf, one at a time, so a full set in your cabinet meant years of loyalty. Those dishes are collector's items now. The company built supermarkets, too. The Jewel Food stores you may still know, but the wagon and the route and the man at the back door, that whole gentle way of buying groceries ended in January of 1981. If you grew up anywhere in the South, Winn-Dixie stood at the center of town, right up there with the church and the barber shop. And in the small towns, it was often the only grocer for 15 miles. It grew out of a single store. A man named Davis bought in 1925 with $10,000 borrowed from his father and became the great grocery chain of the Southeast. More than 1,100 stores across 5 southern states and the Bahamas at its peak. Everybody knew what Winn-Dixie was. It was the beef people, that tagline running for years. The meat counter the heart of every store, the union butcher cutting fresh behind the bright glass. Regulars knew their butcher by name, and years later, people on old message boards still ask what happened to him. Winn-Dixie still exists, but the Winn-Dixie your mother knew is gone. When Walmart moved in and undercut the prices, the chain went into a long slide, and in 2005 it filed for bankruptcy, closing hundreds of stores and eliminating more than 20,000 jobs. The company that came back afterward wears the name your mother knew and little else. And here it is, the biggest of them all, the one your grandmother shopped before your mother ever did, the one half of America shopped. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, A&P. Start with a smell, because that is what people remember. The coffee, ground fresh right at the front of the store. 8 o'clock beans turned to grounds while you waited. One shopper put it simply, that the smell of the coffee at the front of the store was the very best memory of all. Back in the aisles were the house brands your mother trusted, Jane Parker, bread and donuts, and the fruit cake that showed up every holiday, Ann Page in the cans, all as good as the national names, and cheaper, and at the register, starting in 1962, you got plaid stamps, one for every dime you spent. Now understand how big A&P really was, because you cannot grasp the fall without it. It began in New York City in 1859, and by 1930 it ran 15,700 stores. Say that number again. Almost 16,000 grocery stores, doing nearly $3 billion a year at a time, when that sum was almost unimaginable. By the 1940s, 1 out of every $10 Americans spent on groceries was spent at A&P. It was Walmart before Walmart, in every town, on every list your mother wrote, and it was A&P that led the change. In 1936, it opened its first self-service supermarket, and within a few years it had closed thousands of its little counter stores for a smaller number of big ones, cutting its store count in half while selling more than ever. That was the mountaintop. The fall took the rest of the century, and it was slow, the way these things always are. It sold off 8 o'clock coffee, the very thing that scented every store, in 2003. It shrank decade after decade, a great empire coming down one store at a time. When a 47-year-old A&P in Brookfield, Illinois, closed in 2005, weekly shoppers who had gone since the 50s mourned it like a neighbor. And then, in July of 2015, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company filed its final bankruptcy, and by that Thanksgiving, the last 86 stores had closed their doors. 15,000 stores in 1930. 86 left at the end. 156 years, and then nothing. 15 names. Count up all the Saturdays. The coffee ground fresh at the front of the store. The butcher who knew what cut your mother liked. The little book of stamps filling up on the kitchen table, 1 dime at a time. We told ourselves it was just groceries, that a cheaper store on the highway was the same thing, only better. But the cheaper store did not know your name. The man at the meat counter knew your name. We traded that away for a lower price, and nobody warned us we were trading anything at all. So here is where you come in. Which store did your mother push a cart through every week? What was the name over the door in your town? The one that is gone now? Tell me below. I read every one, and if this brought back the smell of a store you had forgotten, pass it on to someone who walked those aisles beside you.